Hello, and welcome to our webinar, YA for All, Genre-Bending Young Adult Titles That Can't Be Missed. I'm Sarah Hunter, editor of Books for Youth at Booklist. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some technical details. The audience is in listen-only mode, but we welcome any questions you may have. On the bottom of your screen is a toolbar with a section for Q&A. If you have a question or need technical assistance, simply click the Q&A and type your message into the box that appears. We will do our best to respond to all tech-related questions, and we'll pass along all other questions to today's panelists so they can follow up with you after the webinar. Links to today's slides and title list were included in the reminder email you received from Zoom 1 hour ago. To download them, please open that email, scroll to the bottom, and click on the links located there. You can also download these materials at any time by copying the URLs on this screen into your web browser. Today, we will be talking to Nic Stone, author of Dear Justyce, Kim Johnson, author of This Is My America, Karen M Mcmanus, author of The Cousins, and Trung Le Nguyen, creator of The Magic Fish. We're going to begin our panel today with a brief introduction from each author about their book, starting with Nic Stone. Nic is an Atlanta native and Spelman College graduate. Well, after working extensively in teen mentoring and living in Israel for several years, she returned to the US to write full-time. Nic's debut novel for young adults, Dear Martin, was a New York Times bestseller and William C. Morris Award finalist. She is also the author of the teen titles Odd One Out, a novel about discovering oneself and who it is okay to love, which was an NPR Best Book of the Year and a Rainbow Book List Top 10 selection, and Jackpot, a love-ish story that takes a searing look at economic inequality. Thanks for joining us, Nic.
Whee! Hi, friends. Yes, I am Nic Stone, author of all of the books that she just mentioned. And I write books, including this one, Dear Justyce, because I would really love for us to get to a point in the world where people are not crappy to each other. Dear Justyce follows a character that we meet in Dear Martin. This young man's name is Quan, but where Justice, the main character from Dear Martin, is doing everything right and still having to face things like systemic racism, Quan is very much not doing everything right and has landed himself in a bind more commonly known as juvenile detention. This is a story that came out of a conversation I had with a couple of my mentees. I have been mentoring young people since I was a young person. And as a result of Dear Martin, I had the distinct pleasure of meeting two sophomore boys from a high school in Columbia, Missouri. And these two boys texted me one day after, they both read and loved Dear Martin. But they texted me one day in November of 2018 and basically asked me if I would be willing to write a story about someone who was more like them. And after charging me basically with this assignment and saying, you're our voice, I obviously couldn't say no. So I spent some time in juvenile detention centers, interacting with the kids who are there from anything starting with like truancy is something a kid can be arrested for, all the way up through murder. I met a couple of kids who were in for murder. But what I can say about these kids and about this book is that everybody that I met in these spaces really just wanted somebody to believe in them. They wanted somebody to look out for them. They needed to know that there was somebody out there who has their back in some way and who is willing to listen. So my hope with Dear Justyce is that where Dear Martin was kind of this clarion call to recognize that, we each get to decide how we're going to present ourselves to the world. No matter what changes or doesn't change, we each have to come to a point where we decide what kind of people we are going to be and how we're going to treat others. Dear Justyce is the shout for empathy and for people to begin to recognize that empathy is something you choose. It does not come naturally to most of us. And sometimes it takes lowering one's own guard and shoving aside their preconceived notions in order to recognize someone else's struggle. So Dear Justyce is out now. It's been out for like 3 weeks. which is weird because I haven't left my house. It's weird having a book come out when you haven't left your house in a long time. But anyway, I hope you all read it and enjoy it.
Thank you, Nic. Next, we'll hear from Kim Johnson. Kim has held leadership positions in social justice organizations as a teen. She's now a college administrator who maintains civic engagement throughout the community while also mentoring Black student activists and leaders. This Is My America is her debut novel. It explores racial injustice against innocent Black men who are criminally sentenced and the families left behind to pick up the pieces. She holds degrees from the University of Oregon and the University of Maryland, College Park. Kim lives her best life in Oregon with her husband and 2 kids. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you. Really great to be here. I love anytime I hear Nic talk, just because she just always reminds me of why I do what I do, and she's just an inspiration to me. So I love being on panels with her. This Is My America is my debut novel. I began writing it after feeling like I needed to express sort of this cathartic experience of frustration over the lack of responding to Black Lives Matter. I was really called after looking at the Black Lives Matter movement and the students that I work with. I've worked with undergrads for the past 20 years, and just seeing how they're engaged in their own activism or the questions that they pose. And one of the things that just sort of kept coming up was really trying to understand police brutality as a sort of one entity that impacts, Black and Brown communities. And I was frustrated by the media sort of portrayal of it, of not even looking at them as, people that have families, that have loved ones, that have lived experiences, but as sort of brutal pictures that hit basically people's TV screens, and not really looking at the bigger picture of the larger aspect of our criminal justice system. And so Bryan Stevenson's Just Mercy was my inspiration to think about how can I express the humanity of people, whether they're innocent or not innocent, how we should be looking at them, how we should be wanting to get to know them and their stories better. And so, I wrote a story having a main teen girl as the protagonist, because I thought about all of my students, I thought about myself, the people who wanted to do something when they see something is wrong. And Tracy dedicates her life, even as a young person, writing letters weekly to try to free her father and get Innocence X, an organization that's similar to the Equal Justice Initiative and the Innocence Project, to support her father's case. And I wanted to mirror what I saw with my students, that my students, when they see something wrong, they want to use their voice. They either, protest, they meet, they organize, they hold workshops like Tracy did in my story. They basically move around mobilizing and wanting to do something. And I wanted that to live and breathe in the story. It's also a story, when I was writing it, that I wanted it to feel very real. I looked at all aspects of cases and interviews and people that I know who have been through the carceral state, have been through trials and investigations. I wanted to have it feel so real that you couldn't help but care when you're reading the story. When I think about the voice of my main character, I think about how we can get the actual representation to talk about why Black Lives Matter, why we actually have to say it, why we have to claim it, why it's something that hasn't been recognized. And I also, in telling this story, I'm a mystery lover. So I think of myself as a thriller and mystery writer who also has a deep passion for social justice issues and activism. And I wanted my activists, my student leaders, the people who experience this, to feel very seen in it. And I also wanted to tell the story so that people who just want to right a wrong can sort of experience, well, what would it be like if I was in that particular situation? If I wanted to be able to, tell the story, tell the truth that's there. And so it's a story that has a strong connection to, works like Just Mercy. I would say that it's in the family of Justice Calls. Well, at the same turn, it's also a mystery, a very fast read, a gripping read, something that, you sort of like dig right into when you want to finish right away. And so that's sort of like the bigger picture of my story.
Thank you so much, Kim. Our next author is Karen M Mcmanus. Karen earned her BA in English from the College of the Holy Cross and her MA in journalism from Northeastern University. She is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of One of Us is Lying, Two Can Keep a Secret, One of Us is Next, and The Cousins. Her work has been published in more than 40 languages. Thank you for being here, Karen.
Thank you so much for having me, and hi everyone. I'm Karen M Mcmanus. I am the author of the One of Us is Lying series, as well as Two Can Keep a Secret and The Cousins, which is coming out December 1st, which suddenly doesn't seem all that far away. And I had great hopes back in the spring that maybe I would be having a live launch by the time this book comes out. It doesn't look like that's going to happen, but I'm still excited to get it out in the world. I write twisty young adult thrillers, and I try to write books that will appeal to kids of all ages, all backgrounds. I write multi-POV because I like the idea that any kid who picks up my book will be able to see at least a bit of themselves in one of the characters. I write mysteries that are in some ways light and fun and page turning. And I do that because I want to appeal to as wide of an audience as possible, including reluctant readers. And I very often hear from kids who tell me, I don't like to read, but I liked your books. And that's one of the things I always have in mind as I write is, how do I not lose an audience whose first choice is not to pick up a book? But I do try to also weave in themes that I know my audience is quite possibly wrestling with in their own life. So, these characters are dealing with some bigger issues than just the mystery at hand. They have personal journeys to go on as well. They are sometimes dealing with themes of loss, of addiction, of relationships that are toxic or even abusive, of physical and mental health issues, either within themselves or their families. And as the story goes along, there's this parallel path between figuring out what's happening in this small town or in this family or whatever it is that they're trying to solve, and also understanding themselves and the people around them better. So with The Cousins, I took even, in sort of a new tack for me in that it's not set in a high school, it's a summertime setting, and it's very much about family, and it's about generations of family, and it's about privilege in many ways. And it's a very wealthy family that has fallen apart, and we don't actually know why. Until the very end. And one of the things I wanted to explore in that is the notion of privilege not being inherently a bad thing. You can do great things with your privilege. And in fact, there are generations of the family that have done that and been pillars within their community and achieved good things. But that was lost along the way. And now you've got this younger generation who are an outside to that family privilege. They did not grow up with it. Their parents were disinherited before they ever were born, and they've never met their grandmother. They've never been to this exclusive island where their parents were raised. So they're looking at all of this with an outsider's perspective and trying to understand what happened. So that's my 4th book, and I'm also working on a 5th and 6th in a similar vein. And I just hope to keep writing mysteries that keep kids reading for as long as I can.
Thank you, Karen. Our final panelist is Trung Le Nguyen. Trung Le Nguyen, also known as Trungles, is a comic book artist and illustrator working out of Minnesota. He received his BA from Hamline University in 2012, majoring in studio art with a concentration in oil painting and minoring in art history. He has contributed work for Oni Press, Boom Studios, Limerence Press, and Image Comics. He is particularly fond of fairy tales, kids' cartoons, and rom-coms of all stripes. The Magic Fish is his debut novel. Take it away, Trung.
Hello, everyone. I am so honored to be a part of this panel, and I'm a little intimidated. There were so many fantastic and very self-assured storytellers that have spoken before me, and so now I really gotta shore up my my presentation. So this is my debut graphic novel, and I am very, very excited about it. It is a story that came out of very non-traditional pathways for me as a creative person, as a writer, and as an illustrator and artist. The way that the story came about was that in the summer of 2011, I was an intern at the Minnesota Historical Society, and that summer there was some budgetary discussions that were going on in the Minnesota government, and they couldn't come to a conclusion. And so the government shut down that summer, and I lost my internship because I was considered non-essential personnel, and I did something to fill up my summer, essentially. And I couldn't figure out what to do, and I was in sort of dire straits because my graduation status was about to be endangered because of my lack of an internship. It was a qualifier for graduation, and so I delved back into my comfort zone, and that was telling stories with pictures. I had always been really fascinated with children's stories and with fairy tales, and I have a lot of sentimental attachments to them because I am a first and a half-ish generation immigrant. I was born in a refugee camp in the Philippines, and I came over with my parents, and I grew up in a Vietnamese American household. And we have a powerful connection to the library. It's a really kind of sacred and wonderful space for us. It's a safe place for us to kind of grow and to discover more things about ourselves and to contextualize our experiences. And I used to read a lot of picture books and comic books with my parents, who were sort of learning English alongside me when I was growing up because they were new immigrants and I was just starting to go through the school system in grade school. And so I have a lot of really powerful memories of the library as a space of freedom and of learning. And I wanted to tell a story that really showcased the importance of storytelling in terms of connecting with people and trying to figure out how to tell people that you love them and that you care about them when you lack the language, when you lack the particular vernacular to express those things. While I was telling this story, it didn't actually start out as a narrative of any kind. I was doing several disparate art projects, and I was looking at the different ways that fairy tales change depending on where it finds itself in the world. And I was really fascinated by a lot of the common themes that would prop up in Cinderella stories or in Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid. And so this graphic narrative ended up being a comparison of the different stories and all of the ways that the priorities of the stories change depending on who the storyteller is. I wanted to express that in kind of a very rudimentary sense. When a storyteller tells a story, it's always going to be a little bit confessional. The way that a story comes out, the priorities that take place in the narrative, and all of the ways that stories kind of exist between a storyteller and someone who consumes or reads a story, all of that tells you more about the storyteller and the story reader than it does actually about the content of the story. And I think that's a really beautiful way to kind of to go about expressing a narrative. And that was something that I really tried to grasp my entire life as someone who sort of exists between cultures and exists between different languages. The ways in which we kind of convey our worldview and our context to each other in an effort to connect with each other is very, very important to me. The reason why the graphic novel is a graphic novel and not a prose novel is because I wanted to make sure that I did it in a way that really showcased the ways that curiosity can be stoked by non-traditional means of storytelling, that readers can be engaged in ways that we don't really consider to kind of be a serious undertaking literarily. And so graphic narrative and the engagement of iconography and of visual orthography in the ways that kids and teens and later adults navigate the world and tell stories to each other is a kind of an important priority for me. So that is sort of the impetus of the Magic Fish, and I really hope that everyone enjoys the story.
Thank you so much, Trung. I don't think you need to worry about standing up to the other presenters' bios and introductions, because that was delightful. So now we're going to get started on our panel discussion. So if everybody could turn on their cameras, and then we will jump in with the questions. I'm really excited to talk to everybody today. I think this is going to be a really fun conversation. So we're going to start pretty simply. I'd like you all to talk about what drew you to the particular story that you wrote in the book that we're talking about today. So Nic, why don't we go back and start with you? What drew you to your story of Kwan?
The 2 boys that I mentioned in my introduction, they, it's been highlighted to me over and over again that there's this expectation that if a Black person in this country is going to do well, they have to meet certain standards and live by certain, it's like assimilate or else kind of. And Justice is a kid who does a significant amount of assimilating, and it's really the only reason he's able to get ahead. So in Dear Justice, I wanted to not only address what these young men that I care a whole lot about, I not only wanted to address their concerns and what they wanted to see, I also wanted to make it clear that not everybody gets the kind of opportunities that Justice gets. Not everybody can assimilate. Not everybody has the structure at home, at school even, to do things right. And that, though, should not be a reason that they don't get the support that they need from other sources. And that, I think I just want people to recognize that things like systemic racism and economic inequality, and there are all of these structures and policies that are set up for the sake of keeping certain people up at the top. And we have to push back against all of those things and recognize the way that they manifest in multiple ways, not just in the ways of the life of the boy who's doing everything right.
Yeah. Kim, I wonder if you could follow up on that with what drew you to your story, because I think there's a lot of parallels there.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a deep connection with Nic's work, especially around Dear Justice and the beautiful story that she wrote there and giving voice to people. And I think what I was trying to do with my story was show how you can do everything that you're supposed to do and your life can actually alter very quickly. And I think that that's the story of Black Lives Matter, that any aspect of perfection that you can try to attempt, or respectability politics, or all of those, often doesn't make a difference. And the generational cycle and impact that actually has. And with Tracy in her story, she sort of is looking at these two models in her life. She has her father who moved them after a hurricane that occurred in New Orleans, and moved to Texas and was not accepted in his community, and was actually moving to uplift the family and build something there. And then he was accused, and because he was an outsider, he was looked at as a guilty person, and how the lens of a community looked at her, not only her father, but then her brother, when he was suspected of doing something. And he tried to live as perfect life as he could, try to do track, try to be a good student, was good to his siblings, his younger sister, all of that. And I wanted to tell the story of a family. I also was very intentional in telling this story, is that while it's considered timely right now, people are very focused on issues of Black Lives Matter. I wrote it in a timely way. Obviously, I didn't know all that was going to be happening this summer, but it's something that has been going on for a really long time, and I was very intentional. I wanted the lens to move away from the acts of brutality, and to put the lens back on the family, to focus on the family. So it isn't a story that it does deal with trauma, it does deal with generational impacts, but it deals with family and love and joy and relationships and all these other pieces, so that we can start to humanize. And so that was really intentional in trying to tell a story in a way that I feel like we've only seen a slice of people's real life experiences.
Great. Karen, why don't you go next? Tell us about what drew you to your story.
Yeah, so with the cousins, like I said, it's very much a family story. And I actually got the idea when I was reading an article about the Kennedy grandchildren, and that's obviously a very prominent American family. And I just started thinking about, what must it be like to have a name that just opens any door you could ever want without even you having to knock. And what would happen if you were part of a family like that and then you weren't? What would life be like growing up as a teenager, knowing there was this whole other parallel life you could have had if not for this immense rift in your family? And then taking a look back at where it all went wrong. And there are different layers to this family. And like I said in the intro, it's a wealthy family. They have a lot of privilege. The grandparents use that to do some pretty good things, the parents, kind of turned inward, and we're a lot more selfish. We're a lot more personally focused, sort of us against them type of mentality. And I can't get into too much more without explaining some mystery stuff. But what ultimately happens is that this motto that they have, which is family first always, when you lack empathy and I think a broader focus on community, then that becomes not so much a motto as a threat. And that's what happens with these people. So I wanted to tell that story. I also wanted to tell a fun and soapy story. I call it like kind of a young adult Succession meets Knives Out. There's elements of that. There are ballrooms. There is, there's limo rides, there are rich people behaving badly, there's twisty stuff, but my books are always very character focused too. So at the heart of it, there are 3 kids who have grown up in these very strange circumstances, trying to unravel their family's past while also figuring out who they are.
Great, thank you. Trung, how about you?
Oh, I just realized that I did not give anybody any sense of what my story is actually about, did I? So my story is, oh yes, my story is about an immigrant family. So it's about a mother and a son who are trying to convey different things about themselves to each other. And the son is realizing that he's gay and he's wanting to come out to his parents, but he's encountering some cultural barriers. He goes to a parochial school. It's 1998. He's getting a lot of different messages about what it means to be a queer person in the United States within the context of his time. And on top of that, there is a cultural and language barrier that he's trying to get around to his mother. And so he's having trouble figuring out what the correct vocabulary is. And the reason why I was sort of drawn to this story is that it does a lot of my favorite things. It does, it looks at fairy tales in a comparative lens. It looks at the ways that stories are not always about what they're about. And when we lack the language to discuss things among each other and among ourselves, we sort of like look for different ways to express ourselves that might not seem incredibly direct, but sometimes they're the closest things that we have to the tools to connect with other people. And I think that that's really important. Imperfect ways of communicating with each other tend to be all of the more colloquial ways that we can kind of communicate with each other. And so the crux of the story is how to convey love and how to convey protection in circumstances where you don't really have a lot of agency. One of the things that ends up happening with a lot of immigrant children whose parents have immigrated with them is that they'll develop a certain sense of agency over themselves as kids, and they'll want a childhood that looks like their friends, but their parents have to navigate systems that they are not familiar with, that they don't have the language to navigate to the fullest capacity. And sometimes that means that they can't protect their children in the ways that they would want to. And so a part of the story is the child character has to kind of navigate a lot of these systems on his own, and the things that authority figures tell him without the protection of his parents becomes a point of difficulty and trauma for the characters. And so that's kind of something that I wanted to explore.
Great. Those are all fascinating points, and I imagine that they will come up again as we talk more. I'd like to, some of you touched on genre blending effectively, and I'm very interested in how typical genre conventions, structures of particular genres influence your storytelling and your writing. And Kim, I'd like to talk to you first about this because I know that you mentioned it specifically when you introduced your book. How do genre conventions affect your writing and your book?
I think I come from a place of I don't know what I don't know. So I'm not someone who fits in any kind of sort of convention with the things that I like. It's just the way that my brain operates. When I think about writing, growing up, went to the library every single week, got my Nancy Drew, got my Encyclopedia Brown, got my mysteries. That was like the things that I loved. And then growing up, I was an activist. I loved African American history. I loved thinking about justice. And so when I'm telling my story, I want to write about things that I'm fascinated by. And so, when I talk about like my book, where it sits in shelves and how to describe it, it's hard for me to sort of fit in the current models of the way that stories are, because I don't feel like I naturally fit in a way. I just know what I like and what I, like to read. And, I'm fortunate that like my story was picked up and people, are willing to read something. I was like, wait, I thought this is about social justice. Oh, wait, it's also a double murder mystery. Oh, wait, she's doing crazy things. Is wanting to tell a story that is fast paced. That's the kind of stuff that I like to read. It was important for me. I like depth, stories with depth. I like stories that touch true issues that are real and contemporary, that I feel are about the communities that I'm most connected to, while at the same time having sort of these fascinating ways to making sure that there's like these particular plot points, and that there's sort of these like nuggets of mysteries, because that's what keeps me reading. And so when I think about myself as a young person, if something was too dry or was taking too long, I would just put it down and I would do something else. And so for me, it's also about just keeping the attention of readers, so that they're wanting to like race towards mystery, race towards a solution in the end, and then hopefully it's built in deep enough that they actually want to do a call to action, which is really sort of like my sort of ending, is that there is sort of this well, what do you do as an individual now that you have maybe some tools or information.
I'm also curious if you ever thought about like true crime at all when you were writing your book. I know true crime is something that a lot of people are talking about. Obviously, your book is fiction, but I think especially since it echoes a lot of the Innocence Project structure of how cases are dealt with. I'm wondering if you thought about that at all when you were writing.
Because my story is focused on innocent cases. It's very difficult actually to have access to. I was fortunate to have access to some people, but true crime podcasts were really helpful, not only in sort of breaking the story. I look at Curtis Flowers in The Dark season 2 and sort of his story, and then as I started to do more research, seeing how it was actually so common without so many of the different issues. And I definitely like participated and listened to a lot of true crime just to get a sense of long stories. It's a story that took 7 years for her father's case to even make any movement, and a lot of true crimes are over decades that they actually are covering issues.
Nic, I'd like to turn to you next, because your story also involves a similar sort of structure, and I'm wondering if you thought at all about true crime or other mystery genres when you were writing it. I know your novel's a little bit more epistolary and character driven, but it still has elements of a mystery to it.
Yeah, I've actually been poking Karen in the private chat about teaching me how to write a good mystery, because like it was like semi-intentional, and my mystery gets solved in the middle of the book, so it's not like the book itself is about the mystery. But what I will say is that when it comes to form is like a huge thing for me when it comes to like how a novel is structured. So I can write a story, and there will always be an element of that story that is not just like straight up prose on the page. And that has more to do with wanting to maintain and hold the attention of an Instagram focused audience. So like it has to do with like the eye and changing what the eye is seeing on the page so that the brain stays engaged. Because Instagram has changed our brains. And this is also the reason I love reading graphic novels. So like, shout out to you, Trung, because like you are doing the Lord's work right now. There's very little right now that can hold my attention. So graphic novels and poetry are like my jam. But yeah, there's something about playing with form and having this sort of mystery element that I think was just really necessary for this particular story. Largely because the story centers on the idea of a person being punished. And so for me, there's this question of like, sometimes, yes, the person who is being punished is fully deserving of the punishment that they are receiving, but to what extent, how do we decide whether punishment is just, like where there's like a just amount of punishment that is being meted out? How do we decide what that looks like? How do we decide, what factors go into deciding which kid stays where for how long, and there's some things in the book that aren't really related to the mystery element, but where it's talked about how there's a kid, for instance, who like stabs his dad a bunch of times. And every instance in the book of a kid's story from a detention center is a real one. Like I pulled them all from my own experiences. And there's talk about one kid who is like, there's a kid who's in for like 3 weeks because he missed too many days of school in a row. Whereas you have this other kid, this is a Black kid, whereas you have this white kid who stabbed his dad 8 times in the middle of the night, and he's in for a week because he's got good lawyers and is able to get out. You know, so just thinking about crime and punishment and how these things are affected by other factors, and the mystery piece was pretty central to that.
Yeah. So I've got like dividing paths of conversation I want to follow. First, I want to talk to Trung about form and graphic novels. Can we talk a little bit about that? Because you are, you know, working within a particular format, which is different from the prose novels we're talking about. But can you talk a little bit about how the visual component of your work really shaped the story you told?
Sure, yeah, a lot of that can actually be found in the back matter. And so I always tell people to go through to the back matter, and like that will help inform things a little bit. And so one of the things that I wanted to do with this graphic novel was to kind of give it some training wheels for people who aren't used to reading graphic novels about how to stoke your literary curiosity with your iconographic knowledge. So when you look at an image, what about that image can like help you contextualize what the story is trying to convey to you? And so I sort of cheated a little bit in that I had 3 different characters tell 3 different fairy stories. And it's also kind of fun because you get to play with genres a little bit that way, because there are comparisons of very similar fairy tales, but they're each told kind of in different genres. The first one is a romance, it's about longing. The second one is a horror story, it's about trauma and it's about revenge. And the last story is about how fairy tales and stories in general can be changed to suit the needs of both the reader and the teller of the story. And so the visual elements are kind of largely practical in consideration within the context of the structure of the story. There are distinct color palettes that kind of help the reader discern between whether it's a story that is being told by the characters, whether it's a story that's taking place on the pages, like happening to the characters, and whether it's the past of the characters contextualizing where they are in their lives currently. And so there are a lot of ways that we already know how to read and pick up on a lot of visual cues. And the fun thing about graphic novels is that the orthography, or like the grammar of the pictures as we go along, is particular to every single graphic narrative experience. And so if you read a new book, you are dynamically learning a new grammar, because everyone who makes a comic book, everyone who makes a graphic novel is doing it kind of by their own handwriting. You kind of have to learn the ways that they're communicating. And so it's like you're learning a new language every time you read a new graphic novel. So a lot of the visual elements of the book are particular to the ways that the reader is supposed to engage with the book. It's supposed to kind of shore up the ways that we engage visually with the world and how we read images as they come along colloquially in our everyday lives.
I'm just digging how much you're saying the word orthography.
I realized that I needed to explain what that meant.
Taking me right back to my grad program. I love it. I love it so much. Sorry. Karen, I'd like to turn it back to you so we can touch on thrillers again and mysteries, but I also sort of want to flip the script on you, because you have talked a lot about how you write in a particular genre, but you also write a very character-driven novel, and I wonder if you could talk about some of the ways your novels sort of get away from that thriller genre.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting that I ultimately became a mystery writer because I didn't set out to be one. I had written 2 other books before One of Us is Lying, and there was no mystery elements to either of them. They just didn't get me an agent. And then as I was writing One of Us is Lying, I wasn't really thinking about it as a mystery. I was thinking about it as a character story, you know, like what happens to these 4 characters after this traumatic event when somebody dies in front of them. But of course, there's a mystery around that, and it sounds ridiculous now, but I was about halfway through the story before I fully understood that I was writing a mystery. And I had to go back and layer in things like clues and red herrings and sub-mysteries that would help distract the reader. It's not how I began the story. And I found that since then, now I know that I write mysteries. So I do outline in advance, you know, I try to know certain things. But I think the reason that One of Us is Lying became popular was the characters. So that is where I spend all of my time when I'm thinking. I start with a big idea. You know, it might be The Breakfast Club with murder or Truth or Dare turns deadly, but I don't really know what happens until I know who is part of the story. And I spend a lot of time thinking through my cast. And I think I used, you know, kind of like screenwriting elements and the idea, well, if there's a power trio, right? If there's three, what personality types will interplay well with each other and complement one another, you know, because the chemistry between the characters is almost like another character. And if it's not there, it's going to fall flat and you can't weave the stories together the way you need to. I just found this in my 6th book when I've been writing it. I got about halfway through and I was like, these characters, it's not working. The mystery was fine, but the characters were all wrong. And I just unspooled everything and created brand new characters for it.
Wow. Thank you for those wonderful, wonderful answers. We're going to move on to our next question here. So you all sort of touch differently on the notion of generational trauma in your books. And I'm wondering if you can each speak to the role inherited stories play for your characters as they uncover truths about themselves. Kim, why don't we start with you on this one?
Yeah, it was really important to me to have the generational aspect because I'm wanting to actually tell the lived experiences of Black people in this country, even if they don't have direct experience, say with incarceration in that way, but just the fear of how they are observed and treated, how it impacts their lives, opportunities that they have in it. And being able to demonstrate those sort of microaggressions that occur in the novel of when Tracy is walking down the street, how is she sort of thinking about that entire environment and how she's sort of treated in very subtle ways, to be able to really demonstrate that. The decisions, and this isn't a spoiler because it's kind of in the back of the book, but the decision that Jamal makes when he is suspected of killing a white girl, rather than wait to stay and see what happens, he runs. I think if you don't actually demonstrate how that just sort of generational traumas unfolds, you wouldn't understand. You'd be like, wait, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you just wait to go through this process when his lived experience tells him that he actually can't trust the police? He actually can't trust that they will, listen to him, that he will be able to go against the sheriff son, in this particular story. And it's sort of those kinds of experiences. It's similar with trying to showcase how does Tracy experience her relationships with other people. Who can she trust? Who does she not trust? Why is it difficult for her actually to have trusting relationships with her classmates? And she's sort of an outsider. She has a sort of core knit group, and it's because she doesn't know who to trust. And so having those layers and the storytelling, having there be a younger sibling, Corinne, who's 7 years old in the story, it was important to me to have that, because then it's sort of thinking about what's the trauma that she's witnessing and experiencing about a father that she's actually never had in her home. She's visited him before, but she's actually never had her father, and people are talking about an entire experience that she's never experienced. And it's that sort of like passing down of that history that will then unfold and inform the rest of her life. And so those threads are really important to me in my storytelling, and the kinds of ways that expressing that an individual's experience is not just their own, it's the world around them.
Karen, I wonder if you could talk about intergenerational trauma in your novel next.
Yeah, in The Cousins, that was very much a foundational element. And it's always interested me because I think, obviously our family stories are usually the first stories we ever hear. Someone's telling us who we are, what is the story of us and who are you? And that's how we begin to shape our views of ourselves. And then, of course, the teenage years are when you begin to question all of that. Wonder if the stories your parents told you are coming from a certain lens that you hadn't considered before. And that's what happens in The Cousins. And that's also something that I've addressed before in books like Two Can Keep a Secret. It's really interesting to me to go back to almost a cold case, if you will, or a mystery from a long time ago, because you've got not only what your current characters are thinking and wondering about, but you've got this entire other generation that you can kind of pull from and their perspectives as well. So in this particular book, there are three main characters, but there's also a fourth point of view, which is one of the characters' mother. And it's not as often as the other three. She doesn't get equal time on the page, but she's telling the story of what happened 24 years ago, leading up to everything that kind of explodes at the very end. So it's an opportunity to get inside that other generation and really understand the push and pull between her and her daughter, and why her daughter feels like this very pressing need to understand, because it's not just about, oh, I'm here in this island and I want answers. It's this very like deep-seated personal feeling that if she doesn't get them, she's going to be repeating these, really harmful behaviors that she sees in her mom and in other people in her family. And to some extent, that's how all of the cousins feel.
Nic, how about you? Why don't you talk about intergenerational trauma in your book?
I should unmute. So for me, I remember having an experience where I visited an organization called Children of Promise in New York City. And this is an organization for the children. It's like an after-school program and mental health provider for the children of incarcerated parents. So if you have a kid whose mom or dad is locked up, they can join this program and get emotional support, homework support, after-school assistance. And there are social workers and therapists on site to help them process through things. Because the truth of the matter is, for a lot of people who grow up with a parent who is incarcerated, they are more likely to wind up incarcerated. And that has to do, there are a lot of factors involved here. One of them is economic inequality, it's poverty. It's, if you look at the reasons why people are pushed to commit crimes, especially young people, typically they are rooted in some kind of like basic need. In the book, in Dear Justice, Quan begins stealing because his brother and sister are hungry and he doesn't have any money to get them food. His mother is in an abusive relationship. The man that she is in a relationship with has taken their means of buying food. And so in order for him to feed his little brother and his little sister, he resorts to stealing from a store a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter. And this is the case for a lot of kids who wind up, committing crimes that land them in detention centers. It's rooted in desperation. And that desperation comes from the parents who are desperate. Most of us learn our neuroses from our parents. And when you are coming from a legacy of poverty that you try to kind of get out of through illegal means, it's a difficult thing to break that cycle without assistance, like a lot of assistance and examples of how to do things differently.
Yeah. Do you think about how, I'm thinking, returning to your novels, your characters are all sort of finding ways to tell the stories of themselves, sort of within and also outside the context of their family stories, in order to make a way forward for themselves, in order to find a way to exist in the world a little bit more comfortably. And that is a common theme that I noticed for all of you. And I wonder if you thought about that explicitly when going into writing your novels, or is that something that just sort of naturally came out of focusing on a character who's trying to find their way both within and outside of their family narrative and family trauma? Like, why don't we go back to you on that one?
Yeah, I think a lot of this just has to do with the age genre that we're writing in. Like we're writing for, I write middle grade and young adult, and like we're writing during this time period where developmentally kids are starting to kind of wander outside of the nest and develop relationships with kids from other nests. And those relationships slowly but surely become more important to the kid than the ones inside the nest. I think, and it's a natural psychological stage. It's a natural stage of psychological development where kids, like adolescence is that time where you are trying to figure out who you are outside of your family. So it is deliberate in the sense that like, this is the age I decided to write about. And for me, it's just a thing that I guess comes naturally as I write these stories.
Trung, I realize we haven't talked to you about intergenerational trauma yet, but I think that your book talks about it in an interesting way in literally shared fictional stories. Can you talk a little bit about how that informed your book?
Sure. I think a lot of my my book, I certainly didn't think about intergenerational trauma as like a thing that I needed to edify the audience about. And so a lot of the story is told at eye level from the perspective of the characters, and their priorities kind of shift and change, and I wanted to focus on them. But a lot of the ways that intergenerational trauma kind of shows up in my graphic novel is in terms of responsibility. Each of the characters feels a certain sense of being beholden to the generation before in a certain way. Like, my parents need help doing this thing, I shouldn't bother them with this thing, is sort of Tien's, the young boy's kind of trajectory over the course of the book. And his mother, Helen, has a journey kind of all to herself in terms of what her relationship is to the place where she came from and to the place where she grew up and her mother, and kind of figuring out how to reconcile her desire to to kind of continue on this kind of family legacy on like a very basic level, while also remaining connected to the place where she came from. And oftentimes that's not something that's entirely possible, both logistically and emotionally. It's just not something that a lot of immigrant families have the capacity to do in the fullest sense, in the wholeness of their aspirations. And so the ways that intergenerational trauma kind of show up oftentimes comes in this veneer of disappointment, and it becomes this sort of little crack that grows into something that's much larger.
Interesting. So this next question is for Kim, Trung, and Nic. All three of you wrote like really extensive author's notes to your novels. And I'm really curious about what made you choose to include that extra information. I think, Trung, you called it training wheels, right?
Yes.
Your author's note. That's such a great concept, and I would love to hear a little bit more about your motivations behind adding this additional context. Kim, why don't we start with you on this one?
I felt like it was my manifesto. Like, you should have seen the original version of it. It was like 20 pages of like, and then this happened in 1827. And it really is, it was just my way of like, I'm really sort of expressing the history. Again, it's going back to just feeling like so much of discussions on, the carceral state or police brutality is just a sliver of a moment, and it's sort of judged without all the historical context that has led to why laws are the certain way, and that actually things are working as they were intended to work. And so, I really love bringing in the past as the present, and it was so important for me to sort of go from the beginning, looking at specific laws, looking at specific actions throughout our history that have created the culture that we currently live in, the laws that we currently live in, the impacts that we currently live in, and restating that this isn't new. We just have more ability to learn about this information, but it has always been there. We just have easier access to it because it's not just waiting for media to give it to us. It's that you with your phone can actually put this out there. You will have people who are actually investigating on their own with their own organizations. And so it was important for me. I also, as an educator, as someone who I was very intentional with what I read and what I utilized in the book, I wanted to be able to think about my students or think about teachers or educators, that they would have something to pick up from it and pair it with nonfiction works, and learn more and have the language in a way that maybe they didn't know how to have access to it. So it isn't just about facts, but it also is about the storytelling component and how to combine that.
Cool. Nic, how about you? Tell us about your author's note. Ooh, you're muted again. Sorry.
My bad, bro. I really got to stop doing that. I went like triple overboard. I have 2 author's notes. There's one at the beginning of the book that talks about the impetus for the book, which I felt like it was important to include that because I want people to understand that like I write the books that I do for a reason, and that reason usually has to do with a kid, like an actual human live kid that I know or have met or that I made. Dear Martin was about my kid that I grew inside my body because I'm a superhero. Just saying. But the one at the end has a lot to do with me wanting to point out that the most fictional elements of Dear Justice are the support and the help that the main character receives, because I wanted it to be kind of a call. I won't say a call to action because the action piece can be tricky in a global pandemic, but it's a call to compassion. Compassion as a choice. Like it is a call to, it's a wake up call, I hope. Like I wanted my that second author's note to be all about what I wanted people to take from the book. You know, like I usually say authorial intent. Who decided those 2 words should go together? Like authorial intent, cruel and unusual. Yeah, so authorial intent, I would usually say that it doesn't matter, but it did matter for me in this book. And even if people do not see my intention or understand what my intention was, or even if they don't read the author's note, it was important for me to make sure I had that in there. So y'all know, like there's no question that this is why Nic Stone wrote this book.
Yeah. Everyone should read it. It's very informative. I'm just going to do a quick sidebar here. My husband is a public defender for the Court of Appeals. And I just like, your book was heartbreaking to me for the fact that it ended nicely. I got to this pivotal point in the book and I like wept because I have heard enough about how this really goes, and how it really goes is terrible for most people, for the vast majority of people. So read the author's note and definitely get informed on what the topics are for sure. We're going to, I want to talk to Trung about your author's note, which is wildly different from the author's note in both Kim and Nic's novels, but you have like 2 or 3 different sections in your author's note, and it just goes through so many incredible little bits of detail about your book. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about why you put it in there.
Sure. Okay. So I described earlier that my author's note was something a little bit like training wheels for people who are not super familiar with reading graphic narratives. And I wanted to kind of explore and showcase all of the different decisions that go into storytelling when you use images. And so a lot of it has to do with like how to engage with the characters in a way that is just really radically empathetic, to imagine not only what they look like in the world that they occupy, but what they themselves kind of imagine their worlds to look like as well. So I talk a lot about like the visual imagination and why we think the world looks the way that it does. And so that kind of becomes like a huge component of much of my author's note. My actual author's note is sort of about immigration and about kind of like decentralizing or decentering the kind of gravity of a lot of immigrant stories. Like we usually like to think of those stories kind of from the top down. And I wanted to make sure that the audience knew that this is not supposed to edify you. This is not supposed to demand your curiosity about what it means to be an immigrant or what it means to be a refugee. It demands your empathy. It wants you to relate to the characters, and it doesn't, like, it's not trying to make you a more cosmopolitan person. Like, we authors of color, marginalized authors, do not exist to make you feel more cultured. We have our own stories to tell. So that was kind of the short portion of that author's note. The rest of it kind of comes out of a place where comic books kind of has a little brother complex to like prose books and like literature in general, because there is this conflation with using images to tell stories with children, and it sort of infantilizes a lot of the process of reading a graphic narrative. And a lot of times you can tell stories in ways that you can't really tell like either on the screen through like live action or through filmmaking, and you can't really tell stories quite the same way as you do with prose. You can do slightly different things. And people kind of engage with visual storytelling all of the time. And I kind of wanted to give people an avenue by which to examine why they think the world looks the way that it does. it's sort of a beginner's guide to figuring out what your visual biases are. What images do we sentimentalize, and why do we do that? And where do those images come from? And how do those images, like, what is the relationship between the images that we present kind of in our minds and our imaginations with the truth? And so it becomes a little bit more like, it's sort of an art historical treatise a little bit.
It is. Yeah, I thought it was particularly edifying when you were talking about cultural influences on costumes in each of the different stories. That was one of the things that I found really, really fascinating in that particular author's note. So I know we are at the end of our time, but I want to ask one last question really quickly. If your book was on a library display, what other books would you like to see next to it? Karen, I'm going to start with you. Can you give us 3 books that you would want to be on a library display with your novel?
Sure. Well, you know, some of the classic thrillers people I admire, like We Were Liars, E. Lockhart, or Allegedly by Tiffany D. Jackson. But I also would like to be up there with, you know, Simon versus the Homo Sapiens Agenda by Becky Albertalli, because friend groups is one of my favorite things to write.
Awesome. Kim, how about you?
My boos, Dear Justice and by Miss Nic Stone, and Punching the Air by E.B. Savoy and Yusef Salaam. I think that's the trifecta for 2020. And then I also would want to be right next to like A Good Girl's Guide to Murder, or even One of Us is Lying, or you know, anything that's a mystery. Yeah. So I like to take over sections. So I need to be in multiple areas.
Trung, why don't you go next?
I want to be somewhere around, I don't know, like a Jean Yang book. Like I like American Born Chinese was so important to me in terms of like graphic narrative and storytelling and identity building. That's something that I would love to see happen at some point. And maybe even by like a Raina Telgemeier, something kind of middle grade and something relatable. Like they're like, you know, graphic novels that are not afraid to tell stories that would be considered too mundane for the superhero set.
And Nic, we'll close out with you. What books would you like to see on a library shelf with Dear Justice? Oh no, you're muted again.
Guys, I'm winning today. I'm gonna go in a totally different direction here. I want to see, because like my thing, I write heavy books, and I don't want to put my book with other heavy books, because nobody needs this much heaviness in their life. So I would put mine with Case and Callender's Felix Ever After. And then I would put on the other side probably Leah Johnson's You Should See Me in a Crown. Like, I think that there should be like, I want there to be joy books next to my lack of joy book.
Yeah. That's wonderful. Those are great library displays for all of our librarians listening, in case you need ideas for when your library is open to the public again. All right, thank you so much, Nic, Kim, Karen, and Trung. That was a fantastic conversation. I'm really happy that we had it. Tomorrow, all attendees will receive an email containing links to today's slide presentation, title list, certificate of completion, and video recording. For more about Booklist webinars, be sure to visit www.booklistonline.com/webinars, where you can view archives of past webinars and register for upcoming ones like the ones you see here. If you haven't already, be sure to check out Booklist Reader, where Booklist contributors post daily about all things books and library land. Not yet a subscriber? Pair the page-by-page reading experience of print with the convenience of online access at booklistonline.com, and lock in print, online, digital, and archive access by taking advantage of this special webinar offer to get Booklist for only $75. Thank you again for joining us for today's webinar. And one more thank you to our sponsor, Random House Children's Books, and our fantastic panelists. This concludes today's webinar.